Hello, people of YouTube. The war in Afghanistan has come to its surprisingly and fortunately not so brutal yet nonetheless shocking end. And before I give any of my thoughts on it, we are going to watch together some news coverage of this historic event, and we are going to watch President Joe Biden's speech shortly after the capture of the capital city of Afghanistan, Kabul. I'm going to add a screen capture so we can watch the Taliban storm the presidential palace together. And I'm going to select the parts of the news report from Al Jazeera which I think are the most interesting.
We're just going to bring you these live and exclusive pictures here from inside the presidential palace. What you are looking at right now is Taliban fighters inside the presidential palace. This is these pictures exclusive on Al Jazeera. We've been watching them for a few moments now, milling around the lush environs of the presidential palace. We're not sure if they're making an announcement yet, but the camera has been trailing those fighters as they make their way through the halls of the Afghan presidential palace. Wandering up through the building, decked out in its finery. Of course, this after the Afghan president fled the capital. That's them taking their way through the marbled halls of the presidential palace, showing that's it's one of our Arabic colleagues who is basically showing, doing a quick show and tell around the presidential palace, where of course many Taliban fighters are accompanying him with weapons slung over their arms. A very grand building, a building, of course, that played host to many dignitaries, and, of course, where the Afghan president was the one-time ruler of the land. I'm not entirely sure which desk they are sitting behind, but there it's almost like a family photo shot of the Taliban fighters sitting behind a very grand desk in the middle of the presidential palace. Let's bring in our correspondent in Kabul, Rob McBride. He's at the Al Jazeera Bureau. When we get a translation, of course, we'll try and bring that up. But for now, Rob, we're just showing our viewers these fairly stunning exclusive pictures, I also have to add, from Al Jazeera, of Taliban fighters placing their guns on the desks, sitting behind the desk of, we assume that is the desk of the Afghan president. A fairly stunning turnaround of events in Kabul. You started the day certainly with the news that the Taliban fighters were surrounding the city. Now they're inside the presidential palace.
Absolutely. I mean, this has been a remarkable day of fast-changing events, and it continues into this Sunday evening. Yes, we saw earlier on this Sunday evening, in fact, still images of Taliban fighters inside the palace. Now we have moving images. We also have been seeing images of Taliban fighters outside the palace, posing for selfies with the fellow fighters, etc. So so very much this has been a day that, yes, began with the encirclement, the siege of Kabul, pulling the noose tighter, if you like, around the city. The culmination, of course, of weeks of gains by the Taliban across Afghanistan, taking province after province, gradually forces falling back as provinces fell, and all of the focus, all of the attention, all of this great momentum that the Taliban built up, then being focused and directed towards Kabul itself. So this was the last remaining holdout of this government, as well as a couple of adjoining provinces and cities, but all the focus has been on Kabul. And then at the start of the day, we started to get reports that fighters were not only on the edge of the city, but were actually entering parts of the city, which really did raise the level of unease, the whole tension level. It was quite palpable. You could really feel that the presence of the Taliban was very close. And now we have had, despite an order earlier on Sunday that Taliban fighters should not go into the city, they should hold back, as we heard there, they should be restrained. There were reports of looting. We know that as soldiers withdrew, some of the police officers we know actually got rid of their uniforms and put on civilian clothes. There were reports of various acts of looting around the city. We know that one university was broken into. So that seemed to coincide with this move by the Taliban to direct its fighters to actually go into the city, ostensibly to stop the looting. That's at least what they have said, to maintain law and order, countermanding, it seems, their earlier order to do so. So that's what we've seen.
All right. Now we are going to watch some of President Joe Biden's speech on this matter.
The developments that have taken place in the last week, and the steps we're taking to address the rapidly evolving events. My national security team and I have been closely monitoring the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and moving quickly to execute the plans we had put in place to respond to every constituency, including and contingency, including the rapid collapse we're seeing now. I'll speak more in a moment about the specific steps we're taking, but I want to remind everyone how we got here and what America's interests are in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. These threats warrant our attention and our resources. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. threats to the United States in the region, and act quickly and decisively. Just a little over 3 months after I took office, U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. What's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. Always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something that Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. We could not provide them was the will to fight for that future. There's some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers. Here's what I believe to my core. It is wrong to order American troops to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not. The political leaders of Afghanistan were unable to come together for the good of their people, unable to negotiate for the future of their country when the chips were down. They would never have done so while U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, bearing the brunt of the fighting for them. And our true strategic competitors, China and Russia, would love nothing more than the United States to continue to funnel billions of dollars in resources and attention in the stable, to clean up the corruption in government. And again, when I spoke by phone to Ghani in July, we had very frank conversations. We talked about how Afghanistan should prepare to fight their civil wars after the U.S. military departed, to clean up the corruption in government so the government could function for the Afghan people. We talked extensively about the need for Afghan leaders to unite politically. They fail to do any of that. I also urge them to engage in diplomacy, to seek a political settlement with the Taliban. This advice was flatly refused. Mr. Ghani insisted the Afghan forces would fight, but obviously he was wrong. So I'm left again to ask of those who argue that we should stay, how many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war when Afghan troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Mistake of staying and fighting indefinitely in a conflict that is not in the national interest of the United States, of doubling down on a civil war in a foreign country, of attempting to remake a country through the endless military deployments of U.S. forces. Those are the mistakes we cannot continue to repeat as long as anyone. I've been throughout Afghanistan during this war, while the war was going on, from Kabul to Kandahar to the Kunar Valley. I've traveled there on 4 different occasions. I met with the people. I've spoken to the leaders. I spent time with our troops. And I came to understand firsthand what was and was not possible in Afghanistan. So now we're focused on what is possible. We will continue to support the Afghan people. We will lead with our diplomacy, our international influence, and our humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy and engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, of women and girls, just as we speak out all over the world. I've been clear, the human rights must be the center of our foreign policy, not the periphery. But the way to do it is not through endless military deployments. It's with our diplomacy, our economic tools, and rallying the world to join us. Now, let me lay out the current mission in Afghanistan. I was asked to safely shut down our embassy and transferred our diplomats. Our diplomatic presence is now consolidated at the airport as well. Over the coming days, we intend to transport out thousands of American citizens who have been living and working in Afghanistan. We'll also continue to support the safe departure of civilian personnel, the civilian personnel of our allies, and Afghans who otherwise are at great risk in U.S. news agencies. I know there are concerns about why we did not begin evacuating Afghans civilians sooner. Part of the answer is some of the Afghans did not want to leave earlier, still hopeful for their country. And part of it because the Afghan government and its supporters discouraged us from organizing a mass exodus to avoid triggering, as they said, a crisis of confidence. American troops are performing this mission as professionally and as effectively as they always do, but it is not without risks. As we carry out this departure, we have made it clear to the Taliban, if they attack our personnel or disrupt our operation, the U.S. presence will be swift and the response will be swift and forceful. Are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a stable, united, secure Afghanistan, as known in history as the graveyard of empires. What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago or 15 years in the future. You have to be honest. It's America, and the buck stops with me. I'm deeply saddened by the facts we now face. But I do not regret my decision to end America's war fighting in Afghanistan and maintain a laser focus on our counterterrorism missions there and other parts of the world. Our mission to degrade the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and kill Osama bin Laden was a success. Our decades-long effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan was not, and I wrote and believed it never could be. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war, taking casualties, suffering life-shattering injuries, leaving families broken by grief and loss. This is not in our national security interest. It is not what the American people want. It is not what our troops, who have sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades, deserve. I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end. While it's been hard and messy, and yes, far from perfect, I've honored that commitment. More importantly, I made a commitment to the brave men and women who serve this nation that I wasn't going to ask them to continue to risk their lives in a military action that should have ended long ago. Our leaders did that in Vietnam when I got here as a young man. I will not do it in Afghanistan. I know my decision will be criticized, but I would rather take all that criticism than pass this decision on to another president of the United States, yet another one, a fifth one. Because it's the right one, it's the right decision for our people, the right one for our brave service members who risk their lives serving our nation, and it's the right one for America. Thank you. May God protect our troops, our diplomats, and all brave Americans serving in harm's way.
Mr. President, what do you make of the Afghans clinging to the aircraft?
How can you take no questions on this?
Well, this is very obviously a very grim and tragic moment in human history. So I'm going to be frank with you and give you my just some quick thoughts, my mixed feelings about this decision, just from my perspective, without too much elaboration. Just, some short thoughts. On the one hand, I absolutely hate what I would regard as imperialism and U.S. military presence abroad, especially U.S. occupations and wars abroad, which I don't think have any justification, just like the war in Afghanistan, which was waged from 2001 to 2021. So people who are familiar with my politics might think that I favor this decision. And while I certainly don't think the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was a bad thing by any means, in fact, to some extent it was inevitable given that the Taliban had taken control of most of the country even well before this withdrawal was initiated, I do have a reservation about this decision. And I'm going to show a clip, if I can find it. There it is. From a man who I respect quite a bit, Professor Noam Chomsky, who I think does a good job articulating the reservation that I have about this decision. So I'm going to show you the clip. I'm going to add another screen capture, and I think he does a good job articulating the downside of a decision of this nature. And he's going to draw some parallels to the invasion of Afghanistan by the old Soviet Union. So I'm going to add the screen capture as soon as I can. All right, the screen capture has been added. Let's go to YouTube. And ignore the stupid New York Times advertisement.
Professor Chomsky, regarding Afghanistan, if U.S. troops pull out suddenly, will we not be leaving the people of Afghanistan, particularly women, at the tender mercies of the Taliban?
That's the debate that's going on. And like much of what happens, I think we ought to ask ourselves whether the right questions are being asked. You know, any scientist will tell you if you ask the wrong questions, you get crazy answers. The trick is to ask the right questions. The real question is, who's to make that decision? Do we have a right to make that decision? I mean, did the Russians have the right to make that decision in the 1980s? Actually, they debated the same point with some justice, probably more justice than we have. The Russians, if you look back at the debate in the night they invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, and at least in some areas, like the capital, Kabul, women's education was carried out pretty extensively. Women were pretty free. They could dress the way they wanted and so on. They had problems. The main problem they had was that the U.S. favorites, the U.S.-backed terrorists like Gulbuddin and Hekmatyar, got their kicks out of throwing acid in the faces of women who weren't properly dressed by their standards. And they discussed seriously the fact that if they pulled out, they'd be exposing these women to the mercies of the U.S.-backed radical Islamist terrorist forces, which is incidentally what happened. As soon as they pulled back, a year or two later, the U.S.-run terrorist forces took over, and they practically destroyed Kabul. They instituted a system so hideous that when the Taliban came in, they were actually welcomed. Well, does that mean that the Russians shouldn't have made the decision to pull out? Well, no, I think they should have pulled out. But the point is, it wasn't their decision to make. The decision lies in the hands of the victims. Invading armies simply have no rights. They have no right to make any decisions. They have responsibilities, that's all. So you can't really answer the question because the question presupposes something that we shouldn't accept, that we even have a right to make a decision. Well, what's likely to happen? We have some, evidence about that. Nobody knows for sure. We'll be worse if we stay. It will be better if we stay. You can't answer that clearly any more than you could in the case of the Russian invasion. But we have, and as I say, it's not our decision to make. But there is some evidence about it. I mean, there are U.S.-run polls, or Canadian-run polls, Western-run polls, and it's not easy to get a real feel of popular opinion in a country that's under military occupation, attacked from all sides. But they do have there's a pretty steady thread that runs through them. You look at the headlines and they're not inaccurate. They say, yeah, the population would like us to remain, but they would like us to remain for aid and reconstruction. They don't ask us to stay with the violence. And in fact, a large majority of the population of Afghanistan, at least judging by Western polls, seems to think that if the Western in occupying armies withdrew, they'd find a way of resolving their problems among Afghans. They don't think, incidentally, that the Taliban would take over. A considerable majority think, well, we'll work it out somehow. And remember, the Taliban are not their only fear. There's also the U.S.-run backed warlords who are no better than the Taliban. I mean, in fact, there's a marvelous book about this, which if you haven't read, I'd suggest you should. It's by Malalai Joya. It's a marvelous young woman who is now not so young, but she lived through the Russian occupation, the U.S.-backed warlord monstrosities in the early 90s, the Taliban, and now today, she managed to get herself, all through this period, she's been working underground, running schools for girls, all sorts of things like that, exposing herself to enormous danger. She had a lot of popular support, enough so that she was elected to the parliament, but as she was thrown, under the current government, she was thrown out because she didn't shut up. She kept condemning the warlords who constitute the circles around the ruling government, and they threw her out. She's now living underground under heavy protection, but she talks. She even comes to the United States sometimes, in fact, maybe coming soon, and she has a very interesting book about this in detail, in which she concludes, in answer to the question, that the people of Afghanistan need an invasion of schools, hospitals, roads, but not an invasion of guns. And, you can't be certain that one courageous person with plenty of support speaks for the population, but certainly speaks for them a lot more than General McChrystal or Barack Obama. And in fact, we have good reason to believe that she's probably right. But to go back to the original point, it's just not our decision to make. I mean, we know what President Karzai himself has said. He was a U.S. favorite up until Obama's election, and then he became a bad guy. And the reason's pretty straightforward. His first message to Obama was stop the military attacks against Afghan civilians and set a timetable for withdrawal of foreign forces, meaning U.S. troops. Well, that's unacceptable. We're the ones who make those decisions, not you Afghans. I don't think much of him, nor does much of the Afghan population, but it's worth remembering that. Actually, I'll just end with one further comment. Recently, a couple of months ago, a British specialist on Afghanistan, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, who's high official in the British Joint Intelligence community working specifically on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's been ambassador. He was ambassador to Russia during the period when the main issue was their withdrawing from Afghanistan. Anyway, he just went on a personal tour through Afghanistan in which he spoke to all sorts of people, and he came out with some interesting conclusions. They're reported in the business press, as usual, British business press, not here. His main conclusion is that across the board, even among the strongest supporters of the U.S. invasion, he said the most popular figure in Afghanistan, in their memory, is Najibullah. He was the communist-imposed dictator, basically, with a pretty miserable record himself, but who stayed on after the Russians withdrew and tried to maintain some kind of a functioning government until they were overwhelmed by the radical Islamist extremists, the Hekmatyars and others, who the Reagan administration had been backing, and he was finally murdered. But he's the one person they remember with some recent person with some respect. It's also, I said that would be the last comment, but one more. It's worth remembering that up until the 1980s, Afghanistan, it's not just a tribal group of savages, and they're making real progress towards modernizing the society. To give just one example, having to do with women. Women got the vote in Afghanistan before they did in the United States. It's not a primitive society, and there's every reason to suppose they could deal with their problems. They are now, as Joya points out, facing three major terrorist forces, the Taliban, the warlords who constitute the government, and the invading armies. And somehow they've got to be free of all of these. Well, it's up to them to decide how to do it, not us.
I should state for the record that I cannot confirm whether that statement about Afghan women getting the vote before women got the vote in the United States is true or not, although I would not be surprised if it was. So suffice to say, we do have some degree, not some degree, we do have responsibility to the people whom we put in very bad situations that they ought not be in. So it should just be noted, and Professor Noam Chomsky elaborated on it there, the government we installed in power in Afghanistan, are not nice guys. They're not the proto-fascist, theocratic Taliban, which is now in charge running their own totalitarian state over a country the size of Texas. But nonetheless, they are corrupt, they are brutal, they are autocratic, they are warlords, they are misogynists, right? They're not nice guys. And that government, combined with the U.S.-inflicted war, has caused the population of Afghanistan a lot of damage, right? Let's keep it real. But on the other hand, I do think there was a better way to end this war apart from just withdrawing U.S. troops, period. And by that, I don't mean the U.S. government is going to defeat the Taliban. I think people who have that expectation have an unrealistic assessment of the situation on the ground there. They're an indigenous army which has tons of geographic advantages, tons of support amongst the population, apart from the urban parts of the population. I'm talking about the rural areas, the villages, the valleys. But nonetheless, they do have a lot of support, and, they thrive from the fact that the Afghan army is so corrupt and so dependent on American troops that they can gain recruits by portraying the Afghan government correctly as a puppet regime of the West generally and the United States specifically, which of course is true. And that makes it a very hard, that makes this a very hard war to win, apart from, say, using H-bombs, for example. And in fact, when the Soviet Union ran their own counterinsurgency, put counterinsurgency in quotes, so it's a little misleading, but when the Soviet Union ran their own, basically, terrorist campaign in Afghanistan, it was estimated that they wiped out something like 50% of the villages in Afghanistan and murdered anywhere between 1 to 2 million people, depending upon how you count it. And they still weren't able to beat the insurgents. So when I'm talking about ending the war in Afghanistan, I don't mean trying to suppress an insurrection that is trying to overthrow a government that we support. Even the act of doing so has the potential to create more conflict and could mean very dire things for the people of Afghanistan. That said, though, I think an option that could have been pursued, which was not pursued because the Afghan people are not a high priority for the U.S. government, is simply to have pursued some kind of a peace agreement with the Taliban, that the United States could have helped facilitate, right? U.S. troops basically could have stopped military operations, and basically they could have promoted some kind of reconciliation and accommodation between the two opposing groups. One being the Taliban, the Islamic fundamentalist insurgency, and the other being the collection of warlords that are called the government of Afghanistan. And I believe that's what should have been done in this situation. I do think pulling it out was the right decision, but I believe it was implemented in the wrong way. We can't just throw a problem into the laps of people, for whom we created the problem in the first place and expect them to deal with it and act like we have no responsibility. Our primary reason for ending the war should be the welfare of the Afghan people, not the welfare of ourselves. Even though, yes, it is true, the United States has suffered from this war. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of dead U.S. soldiers, and honestly just a bunch of money that's been wasted on things that are totally unproductive, right? Those are not insignificant costs. But when you're talking about military conflict all over the place in a vulnerable third world country, with, according to one estimate, by the end of this war, 212,000 people dead from the U.S. war, those costs are insignificant compared to the costs that the people of Afghanistan face. And we ought to recognize that. And a critique that I would have of a lot of the people who are in favor of ending the war, which of course we should be in favor of ending the war, let there be no mistake about that. Like I said, I'm opposed to occupations, I'm opposed to imperialism. We should want to end the war for the Afghan people primarily, not ourselves. And that can't be lost in this conversation. So, suffice to say, the frank truth is troop withdrawals are, morally complex decisions, and there's a lot of factors that have to be weighed before you go through with them. And basically, that's all I have to say. I think Biden was right to withdraw, but I think there should have been a longer process geared towards peace and reconciliation in the country, rather than just the U.S. deciding to abandon the place just because the U.S. military is tired of fighting a war, or the U.S. government doesn't think it can impose its favored dictatorship on that Central Asian country. And that's all I have to say. And that will do for now. I hope that you enjoyed my little video here, people of YouTube. And you have a good day.